So we're going to continue our journey into looking at human evolution or hominin evolution by looking at the genus Homo, or the genus that we belong to as Homo sapiens. Now, one of the key shifts that we have once we start talking about the genus Homo is the emphasis on culture, or on stone tools and other forms of material culture. And so we're going to look briefly at some of these, but just note that one of the things that has happened in the last 20 years, in particular, that's because that's what I'm the most familiar with, is that, and especially in the last decade, is that we've been pushing back the timeline on the appearance of the first stone tools. And so for a long time, the earliest stone tools, the Anth101 industry, which is the oldest industry within the early Stone Age or the Lower Paleolithic, we're dating to around 2.5 million years. Which kind of coincide potentially with some of the earliest members of the genus Homo. Now that we have sites like the Lumweki site in Kenya that pushes back the earliest stone tools to 3.5 million years, now what we're having to kind of reconcile or deal with is the issue of basically genus Homo appearing later than stone tools did. So clearly, some species, some genus prior to ours was producing and using stone tools. And I think that's really interesting and compelling in terms of its implications in terms of setting the evolutionary trajectory. Potentially that's why the robust Australopithecines weren't successful, is that they didn't develop stone tool industries, yet they're found at sites where we do have stone tools. So the issue we have is that of context and association, is that we haven't found any hominin skeletal remains where they're actually clasping and have stone tools in their hands, which would be a definitive indicator, at least more definitive, that they were the ones producing these tools. Instead, what we have is sites where we're looking at the stratigraphy and trying to figure out, well, who potentially was making and using these tools. Now, ultimately, the reason why we thought it was members of the genus Homo who was producing and using stone tools is because of a key shift that we see in our anatomy, particularly our cranial anatomy, that shows, again, that increase in cephalization, or that expansion of the brain, and again, a much larger brain to body size ratio that is much more, again, closer to ours than to what we see with even the living apes like chimpanzees. So that's why we were thinking that stone tools were associated with members of the genus Homo and not the Australopiths. But what we're going to see is that earliest members of the genus Homo are still fairly Australopithecine-like. So I have some background information on what these earliest stone tools look like. And what you see is they're basically very simple rudimentary tools where two stones have been struck together deliberately and intentionally to create a sharp cutting edge that could be used for processing not just meats, but also tubers and other plant materials as well. So these are often referred to as chopping tools. I could spend a whole lecture going into why we know for sure that they are tools, that they have the hallmarks, and they're not just simply rocks that naturally fractured in these patterns. They show intentional signs of modification, and we've been able to test and prove this pretty definitively through using experimental work. So yes, these are tools, and yes, they are created by one of our early ancestors. So let's look at the earliest members of our genus. You can see, again, dating to that kind of critical period in which we saw, for the longest period of time, Anth101 tools. Now we have tools that predate that. And we find them in both parts of Eastern and Southern Africa. And there are two kind of core species that we see: Homo habilis, so-called named as the Homo handyman, right, so the tool user, and Homo rudolfensis. Now again, there's a bunch of debate as to whether or not the variation in these earliest forms represent potentially sexual dimorphism or East versus Southern adaptations. Basically, what we see here is that they're continuing the kind of gracile Australopith pattern of not having big bony ridges and crests. You can still see they have pretty pronounced eyebrow ridges, or what do we call supraorbital tori. But overall speaking, that they're much less robust than the robust Australopithecines, and their cranial vaults, as you can see, are starting to expand. They have more foreheads. They're starting to look more human-like, and this is because of expansion in the brain case. We're also seeing important changes in dentition as well. They're getting more gracile, smaller, much more akin to, again, humans than not. Interestingly, if we look just at anatomy, the next genus, the next species that should fall in line would be that of Homo naledi, but interestingly, it dates to much more recently, on the scale of a couple of 100,000 years versus a couple of million years. And Homo naledi was found from the Rising Star Cave in South Africa, representing at least a minimum number of 15 individuals, some of which you can see here are fairly complete. So we have lots of cranial and postcranial remains. The reason why we thought initially, based on just their analysis of the remains before the dates came back, and there's a whole bunch of issues with dating the site that we don't have time to go for in this course, is that they still have, again, this mosaic of, kind of ape-like traits, so kind of smaller cranial vault relative to other members of the genus Homo, curved fingers, right, suggesting arboreal adaptation, but a very modern foot. However, they date to much more recently, and what this suggests is that in certain parts of Africa in particular, again, these more ancestral traits might have persisted, again, in response to specific environmental conditions. So naledi is likely not one of our direct ancestors, but definitely is a key early member of the genus Homo. And this is just showing the cave site. Part of the reason why dating is challenging is simply that how this site was formed, and also how potentially these remains were placed in here. As you can see, there's a couple of openings to get down into this cave system. And originally the site was actually found not by anthropologists or paleoanthropologists or archaeologists, but was found by cavers exploring this system. But there's this area called the Superman's Crawl, essentially it's because you have to go like this through your body and kind of inch your way through it because it's less than 10 inches high. So basically only very small-bodied anthropologists are actually able to excavate in this space. And not only once you get through a Superman's Crawl, you then have to go up over what's called the Dragon's Back, so you have to have some climbing experience to get up over this ridge here. And then you have another very tight, I think this is 14 inches in height to get through here. And then you have to descend using ropes into the Naledi chamber. And this is why it's called Homo naledi, is after this chamber, the Rising Star site. And this is where the fossils have been from. So a very interesting and complex site that we're still interpreting and analyzing. And now with the dates that posit Homo naledi is much more recent, while still having these ancestral traits, means that we have to kind of think about, again, what do these traits actually reflect in terms of what we thought the evolutionary trajectory of the genus Homo are. Okay, so these early members with these ancestral traits, again, still look fairly apey, especially in terms of their upper limb morphology. By 1.8 million years ago, we have a new homonym come into the picture, which is that of Homo erectus, sometimes referred to as Homo ergaster. Again, there's some discussion and debate around what the diversity and variability anatomically in this species form means. Does it mean that we have separate species, or do we have just, again, quite a bit of variation within this species? Again, we're teasing all of this out as we continuously assess and reassess the fossil record, find new finds. But the key thing with Homo erectus is that this is the first species that has very similar limb proportions to anatomically modern humans. Now it's just a matter of their cranial vault kind of catching up to us, as it were. The other key thing is not only do postcranial, do they look very similar to us in stature, so they're almost the same height as us, whereas our other earlier members of the genus Homo and Australopithecus, Ardipithecus are much more akin to chimpanzee in terms of body size, is that we also start to find members of the species out of Africa. So we see the first migration of hominins out of Africa, and it's as early as 1.7 million years ago. So we see basically within 100,000 years, not only does species appear in the fossil record in Africa, but we start to find members of the species outside of Africa. And not just outside of Africa, but in parts of Southeast Asia, so Java, into China, into Europe, so parts of England at the Swanscombe sign, but also at really complex sites like Cimo de los Huesos, or the Pit of Bones, in Atapuerca, Spain. We see Western European sites like Dmanisi in Georgia. And then again, there's a lot of debate as to whether or not we have just kind of this pan Homo erectus species that's present in several parts of the world, or if we have, again, regional variation showing specific adaptations to the different environments. Clearly, what Java looked like at this time and China looked like at this time is very different than what Spain and England and Georgia look like as well. So what does Homo erectus look like? That, again, despite the diversity that we see, that seems to be regional adaptations, we do see some typical traits. So some key things that we see is as a return to a different kind of robusticity in the cranial vault. While they do have a smaller and more vertical face, they do have these pronounced brow ridges, right? These supraorbital tori that are present. And they also have what is called an occipital torus or a nuchal bun, basically a muscle attachment at the back of the skull. The argument is essentially that they still have kind of robust cranial facial features, so that even though they're more upright, their teeth are smaller, their jaw is now underneath, they're not as prognathic, is that there's kind of a counterbalance, that you need all of these neck muscles, remembering that bony ridges often reflect muscle attachment areas, to kind of keep that face upright and facing forward using bipedal locomotion. Again, much larger body size with modern limb proportions. So we're no longer seeing those elongate fingers or those ape-like upper limbs, but instead we're seeing something much more akin to us in terms of limb proportions. And the best example of this is through Narakutomi boy, which was recovered from the West Turkana region of Kenya. And you can see he's a nearly complete specimen. We can age him, so we know that he's still a developing adult. Or developing subadult, but he's developed enough secondary sexual characteristics that it's been argued that he's likely male. So again, between the ages of 11 to 13, some have said that this might actually represent an underestimation. We think that Homo erectus or Gaster was developing, again, much more similar in terms of humans as well. So this is not a key thing. So we think that he might have actually been closer maybe to 16 years of age. He doesn't have his wisdom teeth in. They're developing in place, but they haven't erupted yet. His skeleton is, again, 5'3", so about my height. I'm 5'4". But it's argued that had he reached full maturity, he might have been closer to 6 feet tall. So again, very similar stature to anatomically modern humans. And if we look at traits in his pelvis, in his hips, his knee joints, again, very, very close to anatomically modern humans as well. It's just, again, the cranium is quite distinct and unique. Another shift we see with the appearance of Homo erectus is from the perspective of culture. So we see a shift away from the Anth101 technology into the Schulean tool tradition, and I'll bring some of these into class for you folks to look like. And again, this was a very successful tradition. It extended over over 1 million years, that this was an effective toolkit for exploiting resources from the environment. We know from other aspects of the archaeological record that they were eating big game and potentially even hunting them. So these are some fire-hardened spears from the Schöning site in Germany, suggesting that they were using thrusting spears in order to hunt potentially animals and then consume them. There's other evidence potentially suggesting that maybe they had rudimentary forms of language and ritual evidence, such as this supposedly carved figure. There's evidence of ritual figures. This is the cowboy cranium, and along his orbits here, there's defleshing marks that suggest that after he died, the flesh was removed from his skeleton, so potentially suggesting a mortuary ritual. This is something that's still practiced by some cultures today, that soft tissue is removed prior to burial or cremation. So that it's been argued for this. Some news reports argue that this was potentially a form of cannibalism, but that becomes a little bit more of a cognitive stretch, as it were. But it's clear to say that these remains, the remains of a deceased individual, were being altered. And so that there's some sort of intentional behavior that was going on here. This was deliberate, and therefore potentially indication of mortuary or burial practices. So this is what stone tools look like. I'm just showing an example. So my study area, so this is me in the field 1 million years ago, back in 2008, I believe, or is this 2006? I can't remember. I'm trying to look at my hat, my jacket here, but it doesn't matter. So this is a site from my study area. This is the Isimila site in Iringa, Tanzania. It's an Acheulean site dating back to 1.7 million years ago. And what you can see here is that the surface of this ravine, or this gully, or what we call korongo in Swahili, has hundreds and thousands of these Acheulean hand axes and cleavers. You can see I'm holding one of the big ones here. And we're not quite too sure what the purpose is. Was this like a Swiss Army knife where different flakes could be knocked off the surface of these and utilized as smaller tools? Were these used deliberately as tools? Some suggested maybe these were used as like discs. We're not quite sure, but what is clear is that while we find Acheulean sites scattered throughout the world, or at least the old world, beginning about 1.7 million years ago, this was a highly successful tool industry that was used by hominins, allowed for the expansion, the migration of these hominins, of Homo erectus, out of Africa to adapt and exploit new environments. So it's a really effective strategy, even if we don't exactly understand what's going on. I just want to show you some comparisons. So if we look at Africanus, one of the gray style Australopithecines, and its overall cranial morphology, again, we can see this projecting face, this pulling forward, caused by this large dentition. By Homo erectus, we have a much more upright face. We start to see a bit more of a forehead. We'll notice an overall expansion of the cranial vault, right? Like, so look at how much smaller the face and jaw is relative to the rest of the cranium versus in Africanus and the other Australopithecines. And then here's what we see in us anatomically modern Homo sapiens. Note that the CC refers to cranial capacity, and basically what we see with Australopithecines is a cranial capacity at or slightly larger than many of the living chimpanzees. With Homo erectus, we're verging on the kind of smaller end of anatomically modern humans, so we still don't quite have the fully developed frontal cortex that we have in modern humans. And then with anatomically modern humans, we have a cranial capacity of somewhere around 1300 cc. And then what I'm just capturing here with these slides is the kind of difference in profile. So again, this low forehead sloping, very pronounced and pulled off towards the back, right? We have this very pronounced face. Homo erectus is often described as kind of having this pentagonal kind of shape caused by this occipital bun or this occipital keel. Again, much more vertical face. And then we have, I would say, genus Homo is all about Homer Simpsons, right? Homo sapiens, Homer Simpson, high forehead, domed forehead. And we don't have that pronounced nuchal bun kind of pulling forward back of the skull that we see with Homo erectus. Okay. We have a couple of oddities running around in the genus Homo. One of the most famous is Homo floresiensis, found back in 2003, so-called the Hobbit because of its small stature. So this is what the skull of Homo floresiensis looks like in comparison to Homo sapiens. The reason why I've placed it right after Homo erectus is that essentially Homo floresiensis looks like an incredibly small-bodied version of Homo erectus. So it's only about 3 feet tall as opposed to the 5 to 6 feet tall Homo erectus, but its facial characteristics are very similar to Homo erectus, and its archaeological site or assemblages are very similar to Homo erectus as well. The other weird thing is that the dates don't quite line up. What's interesting, it's been argued that Homo floresiensis is a good example of what happens when a species is adapting and evolving in an island environment without major competitors. So Homo floresiensis is not only small-bodied, a potential dwarf species. It doesn't have dwarfism, that's been ruled out for sure, but dwarf elephants are also found on this island. They were indeed hunting them as well. There's also other kind of pygmy or dwarf or smaller versions of other species on this island. So it's been suggested that potentially when Homo erectus arrived on some of these Indonesian islands, particularly that of Flores, that they basically small-bodied was preferential in this small environment. There wasn't a lot of competitors, so there was no need to be big in stature and size. And so as such, we see this kind of highly specialized, adapted member of our genus persisting in this area. As you can see, the fossils date to between 100,000 to 60,000 years ago. Anatomically modern humans appear in this region potentially around this time period as well, around 60,000 years ago. So this is interesting because it suggests that members of our species came into contact with these small-bodied members of our genus, and this might actually result in some of the oral histories found throughout Indonesia of the so-called wild small men of the forest, and this might be why we have narratives about the small folk of the forest that persist even into other parts of the old world and into the new world today as well. Interestingly, the archaeological sites date to much more older than that, and again suggest potentially that even though we don't have a fossil record, that Homo floresiensis was present, or another member of the genus Homo was present on this island much earlier than to be expected. So again, it's not that our genus is without these kind of anomalies as well. We certainly have this in the case of Homo floresiensis. So after Homo erectus, we start to get into what we call early members of Homo sapiens. We start to see a wide range of archaic species present, again, some appearing in the Middle Pleistocene as early as 900,000 years ago, some persisting much more recently and overlapping, of course, with us anatomically modern humans, which skeletally appear somewhere between 300 and 200,000 years ago. Of course, I've already mentioned in the context of Australopithecines and understanding their variation that we're going through some climatic variations, and the key thing for for the transition to modern humans tends to be the rise of the glacial period, and how this would have greatly impacted the environments that hominins were living in. So there's a variety of what we call archaic or early Homo sapiens species that are referred to by a variety of genus names. Homo heidelbergensis is one, found in parts of Africa, Asia, and Europe. And just note that these early ones don't extend the geographic range of Homo erectus, and some are very Homo erectus-like. Again, it's just these slight variations trending towards the modern human pattern, as it were. So larger brain, more globular domed brain case. Interestingly, what does link them with Homo erectus is these arching high supraorbital torus or brow ridges. You can see here, they're almost like McDonald's arches. Some retain that occipital torus or that occipital bun at the back of the skull. And again, their forehead is much lower in comparison to us. So again, early members of the genus Homo, it's how Australopithecine are you like. Early members of Australopithecines are because is how chimp-like are you. And with archaic Homos, it's like, again, how much similar are you to earlier members of the genus Homo versus how similar are you to us anatomically modern humans themselves. So the Chilean tool tradition continues with some of these species. Later groups develop into the Middle Stone Age. In the Middle Stone Age, we see a variety of different regional stone industries that develop, including things like the Mousterian. Other changes like more apparent use of fire. We start to see in archaeological records simple shelters, wider range of foods being used, and very clear evidence of hunting versus just scavenging remains as well. One of the most famous pop culture symbols of early members of these kind of archaic members of the genus Homo are the Neanderthals. They appear in popular culture basically almost after their first finds were found in the 1850s. So we have Rosny's Quest for Fire, which was a short story in 1911, then made into a film in 1981. Interestingly, it's one of my favorite films because while it was kind of at the time kind of critiqued for maybe stretching what scientific evidence of the time suggests, the representation of basically contemporaneous earlier members of the genus Homo running around with anatomically modern humans seems to be on par with actually what we understand and interpret at this time. H.G. Wells of the Time Machine fame also wrote a book called The Grizzly Folk in 1927. We have books like Golding, who wrote Lord of the Flies, The Inheritors in 1955. John Darnton wrote the New York Times bestseller called Neanderthal in 1996, which involves time travel and Neanderthals and cannibalism and all this stuff. Clan of the Cave Bear, a very famous series I grew up reading by Jane M. Ull, which was heavily influenced by paleoanthropological writings of the time, also deals with Neanderthals. We have Neanderthals in the Geico commercials. Barely people know about them, at least in popular culture, but they're probably kind of misrepresented and misunderstood. One of the things that's unique about the Neanderthals is they're fairly restricted geographical range, so we find them basically throughout the Mediterranean world, but not elsewhere. So we don't find Neanderthals in Africa nor in Asia, but they do extend into the Near or the Middle East, and they're named after where the original specimens were found in Neander Valley, so Neander and then Valley or Tal in German. This is why it's spelled alternatively with Neanderthal and Neanderthal. Both are correct. Just note that the genus, the correct spelling of the genus includes the H because it's Homo neanderthalensis. The first definitive remains date to 175,000 years ago, and then they persisted to 27,000 years ago. So overlap with anatomically modern humans. So they weren't an unsuccessful species, and genetically we know many of them contributed to some of our genomes. Some of us are up to, I think it's between 4 to 6% Neanderthal, and it looks like some key traits, including red hair, may have potentially come from Neanderthals been introduced into modern humans. They're definitely closely related enough with us that we were able to successfully interbreed with them and adapt some of our traits. And we can talk briefly about why we think they died out, that simply they were potentially too specialized to that Pleistocene Ice Age environment. And as the world warmed up again towards the end of the glacial period, anatomically modern humans just were better adapted to a wider range of environments and thus continue to persist. I'm going to bring in the Neanderthal torso to show you, but essentially, again, they have the retention of some of these archaic traits that we see in Homo erectus, such as the occipital bun and the pronounced supraorbital tori, low-sloping forehead. But overall, their postcranial is much more robust than anatomically modern humans. And it's been argued that this is an adaptation for cold, that they're a bit more shorter in stature. And if you remember Bergman's and Allen's rules when we talked about explaining modern human variation, we think that they were essentially, again, adapted for a cold environment. And this includes things like they have a large nasal aperture and nose opening. And if you think about it, when you bring in cold air, when it's minus 30 out, right, if you go outside and go and suck it in through your mouth, it's like a shock to your system. But if you breathe in through your nose operates to moisten that dry air, but also warm it up before it comes into your lungs, and that causes less of a shock for the brain. So we think that Neanderthals were adapted for a cold environment. Interestingly, they also show many healed injuries. So Neanderthals had very strenuous and challenging lives. We think part of this reflects the fact that they were getting up close to they didn't have projectile technologies, but they had spear thrusting technologies, so they were getting up close to the big game that they were hunting, and then basically getting bucked or kind of kicked by these animals, which was contributing to the injuries that they were showing. So again, this close approach to large prey. And the reason for this is that they have an injury pattern that's very similar to modern rodeo riders and rodeo clowns. Again, individuals who are coming into very close contact with large animals and potentially getting injured by them. What they have, again, is a technology that's akin to many of their contemporaries. Again, these are archaic humans, which is Middle Paleolithic or Middle Stone Age technologies. The key things is that these are still flake-based, but there's more diversity in form than we see in the early Stone Age technologies, which again shows a wider range of resources that they're able to adapt and shifts in cognition as well. Again, in terms of subsistence, again, much like other archaics at this time, definitely hunting, big megafauna at this time, and subsisting off largely of this meat that was occurring. Lots of debate as to whether or not Neanderthals were capable of speech or not. This is what's called a hyoid bone. It's located in our throat. It's very pronounced in males of our species, which is what its muscle attachment point for the muscles at the base of our jaw here and our tongue here. And because it's larger in males, this is what results in the Adam's apple. But women have them as well. Female of our species have them as well. The key thing about them is that they're very similar in Neanderthals to what we have in modern humans, and so it's been suggested that potentially Neanderthals were capable of producing speech, but we know from looking at their other anatomy, and particularly how big and barrel-chested they are in comparison to us, they have a very conical shaped torso versus the barrel that we have, is that they were likely not capable of producing the same range of sounds as us, nor able to sustain it for the same capacity as us. There's signs of intentional burials as well at several of these sites. The Shanidar burial, Shandy is probably one of the best known. This was an elder male who was buried, and it looks like he was buried with medicinal plants within the cave site itself. The key thing around the injuries that Neanderthals have is that they heal them, and it's been suggested that Neanderthals were much more akin to humans in caring for their infirm, for their injured, for their elderly as well. So we see signs of degenerative joint diseases, that Neanderthals had terrible teeth, signs of blindness, amputations, and tons of fractures with little to no signs of infection. This is not too surprising. However, we know that chimpanzees, for example, self-medicate using plants that have medicinal properties, including anti-inflammatory properties. So this is a continuation of our kind of primate heritage, but definitely unparalleled in terms of what we see with other hominin species. And again, I mentioned Shandy, one who, when he was buried, this individual experienced quite a bit of healed injuries in his life that would have impacted his overall quality, but he persisted into old age, which suggests that other members of his group were caring for him and supporting him through subsistence activities. And so a lot of debates around Neanderthals and why we see them in popular culture is that while they've been represented as kind of quote-unquote dumb brutes, that it seems to be kind of a bit of prejudice and racism on our part, that Neanderthals were not likely this kind of ape-like beast, but were much more akin to us, and much more modern representations in museums show them as us, that if we were to see a Neanderthal dressed up in our contemporary clothing and riding the LRT, we probably wouldn't identify them as such, except for likely their lack of ability to verbally communicate to the same degree as us. Again, the genetics shows that they're very closely related to us, and indeed have contributed some of their DNA to us, including skin and hair color. I talk about this in the notes below. So red hair likely came from our Neanderthals, which makes sense. They're a European northern adapted species, or at least some of them are. In terms of their mitochondrial DNA, they're very similar to us. In terms of nuclear DNA, again, some variation, but they do have some traits. So it's the MC1R gene that codes for red color in melanocytes. So this is why we have red hair color in some of us. And they also have the FOXP2 gene, which is linked with speech in humans. The understanding and also production of speech, and Neanderthals also have the same variant as us, again, suggesting potentially that, again, Neanderthals were capable of this. The biggest issue, however, is just the recovery of ancient DNA in general. That can make this hard, and because they are so similar to us, distinguishing Neanderthal DNA and Neanderthal-specific alleles and genes is challenging, because how do we know that we have them from shared ancestry versus something that we've potentially got through interbreeding or admixture? In terms of what happened to Neanderthals, there's no evidence of a genocide. It looks like essentially that they went extinct, potentially because they weren't able to compete on the same scale as us, but again, persists to this day in the form of having given us some of their genes that are present. And that leads us now to us, anatomically modern humans. So again, really clear evidence 200,000 years ago. This is an older date now. We just have some recent finds that push this back by about 100,000 years. In terms of the archaeological record, we know that signs of modern humans are present, or anatomically modern Homo sapiens, or AMHSs, is about 300,000 years ago, and we know by 50,000 years ago they're present throughout most of the world, and we have dates now definitively placing anatomically modern humans in North America 25,000 years ago. So contemporaneous with Neanderthals, potentially overlapping with other earlier species such as Homo erectus persisting in parts of Asia. But basically by 20,000 years ago, we're the only ones left. So what happened to us? I shouldn't have to describe what we're characterized as, because we can look at ourselves and we know, again, this larger cranial capacity, small teeth and jaws. I've already mentioned the Homer Simpson, right, high domed cranial vault, high forehead. Interestingly, a very key diagnostic trait is we have a mental protuberance, or a chin. So we have a little bony bump on our chin, and no other hominins have that. So there's something about having a chin that makes us human. So again, a comparison between archaics, Neanderthals, and ourselves here. So again, much smaller faced, reduction again in the robusticity. So again, harkening back, really emphasizing those ancestral traits from the Australopithecines and Ardipithecus of trending towards a more gracile form tends to be the key. Key thing that sets us apart, again, is our culture. And it's not simply stone tool technology, but different kinds of tools, projectile technologies, and things including art that appear as well. So I have some information about that in the slides here as well. And we can talk about some of these in our classes this week. I'll just throw in this as well, that there's clear signs of not just clothing, but to link with a previous topic, body modification in the form of ornamentation. Neanderthals also have this as well, but there's some debate as to whether or not Neanderthals independently invented this, or they simply saw us doing this and started to copy us, or if they traded for these materials as well. However, it doesn't look like they were trading with us for this kind of ornamentation, because the ornamentation, the jewelry in particular that Neanderthals have is kind of different than what we have to some degrees in terms of what we might say the quality of it. So that's a key thing. But it's clear that somewhere between 42,000 and 70,000 years ago, clothing appears in the archaeological record, and we can tell this by looking at body lice. And over this time, we do seem to see a reduction, or we're interpreting or inferring a reduction in the amount of body hair as well. That is simply, again, we don't need the biological adaptation to our environment, because we've now developed cultural adaptations. We don't need body hair to stay warm, to stay clean, to stay protected. Indeed, it might be disadvantageous to have too much body hair and so that therefore it's reduced and focused on just kind of key areas where body hair warmth is critical, so groin, armpits, and the tops of our head. Okay, and then I have a couple of notes that's kind of relating to, again, kind of how in the last decade something that's changed is that our record relating to modern human evolution has shifted away from purely the fossil record and the archaeological record to include genetic information. And so the Denisovians were first identified by extracting DNA that didn't belong to any known species, Neanderthals or us, from a little finger bone from Denisova cave. And so I wanted to provide a little bit of information about this, that while the fossil record shows that Neanderthals and humans were contemporaneous and overlapping with each other in range, we also have at least actually two other species, Denisovians and potentially species X, running around in Asia at the same time that we don't have a fossil record for, but are appearing in terms of being distinct genetic populations. So really interesting work that's being done, again, kind of out of the scope of this class. And what this is showing is potentially the movement of some of these people, again, out of Africa into other parts of the world, and showing the distribution range. And you'll see that Neanderthals potentially are not just a European or Mediterranean species, but extend into parts of kind of Western Asia as well. Denisovians seem to be in this part, and then this is the range of Erectus as it persisted more recently out of Southeast Asia at the time as well. And there's some more notes below. So basically, if we thought the Australopith record was pretty complicated, it's even much more so when we talk about the genus Homo. And a lot of this has to do with the fact that after we see the rise of Homo erectus in Africa at 1.8 million years ago, very quickly we see dissemination or distribution or migration of Homo erectus out into other parts of the world. And then we start to see several regional variations arise. And then at some point, we see modern humans appear on the scene. It's been argued potentially that they arose in Africa again around 300,000 years ago, and then spread out and distribute and interbred with existing populations elsewhere in the world. So I'd like to say when it comes to the genus Homo, the relationship status most certainly it's complicated. And as a student, that should actually make you not groan or worry, but actually should make you excited, because it means that there's a lot more work to be done. And that means we need a lot more paleoanthropologists and archaeologists doing this kind of work. So I'm looking forward to talking about with all of these things with you in classes and our remaining courses, and sharing fossil casts with you so you can examine some of these cranial traits on your own, and we'll look at some postcranial anatomy as well. So take care, and I'll see you all then. Thanks.